I mean, the elders are very concerned that we need to end the impunity of those most responsible. And that's those who are responsible for this breach of the UN Charter by a P5, a permanent five country that should be upholding the UN Charter in the Security Council. It's really very serious, the fact that, first of all, going into Crimea, and the world didn't actually react very strongly to that, which was, I think, in retrospect, a mistake.
And we've been talking about the naval blockade of Ukraine's biggest port, Odessa. But let's talk about another huge issue which has arisen because of the war in Ukraine. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has said they continue to verify hundreds of allegations of violations of international human rights law in Ukraine, many of which may amount to war crimes. And we can speak now to Mary Robinson, who is a former president of Ireland and former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Good morning to you, Mary.
Good morning.
Really good to have you with us. Tell us, first of all, we are hearing almost daily reports of more violations of human rights, potential war crimes. But it does seem as though these are being documented.
You mean in Ukraine? Sorry.
Yes, in Ukraine. I mean, what do
Yes.
you make of what you're
Yeah.
hearing?
No, I think it's very good that there is now the capacity to properly document and make sure we have the evidence to bring to trial those guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which the ICC and the International Criminal Court is now seized of, and I'm very pleased about that. And in addition, the elders are very keen that there would be a real evidence-based looking at whether there has been the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression, is in the international, the statute of the International Criminal Court, but unfortunately, Russia is not a member of it, and neither is Ukraine at the moment. So that means it's something that has to be looked at more indirectly, hopefully, again, through a UN-based approach. So at a very early stage, the elders issued a statement saying we need to look at the crime of aggression. And of course, that would potentially involve President Putin himself.
Yeah, I mean, are you
Evidence is there.
concerned that so far we've seen one relatively young Russian soldier put on trial, found
Yes.
guilty of war crimes? But of course, people want to see those who are further up the chain of command actually brought to justice, don't they?
Yes, I thought it was quite moving that he pleaded guilty. Um, you know, Maybe a sense that what his army, the army he was involved in, was doing just was not right, which it was not, is not. But I fully agree. I mean, the elders are very concerned that we need to end the impunity of those most responsible, and that's those who are responsible for this. A breach of the UN Charter by a P5, a permanent five country that should be upholding the UN Charter in the Security Council. It's really very serious, the fact that, first of all, going into Crimea, and the world didn't actually react very strongly to that, which was, I think, in retrospect, a mistake. And President Putin has been encouraged now to invade Ukraine and cause so much suffering, so much loss of life, so much displacement of people, so much destruction of buildings, including homes, hospitals, etc. It's very sad to see this war in Europe, and it's having terrible knock-on effects, as I discovered, because I've just come back from an extended visit to Africa, to both Rwanda and South Africa, and I could see the impacts on food and fuel and fertilizer of poor countries already coping with COVID, already coping with the climate crisis, and now coping with the impact indirectly on them of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and we were just talking in depth about the situation with the extent of those supplies that are blockaded in Ukraine's ports. Would you like to see perhaps some form of UN agreement to give the go ahead for some form of international coalition to actually break that blockade of the Ukrainian
Yes,
ports?
the elders actually, we issued one statement from our meeting in South Africa, our sort of board meeting that we have twice a year. And we focused on Ukraine because it's so important. And we called for much more effort to, move from ceasefire to real peace and negotiated peace. That, there's too much, of a kind of support for the military solution. There is no military solution. So we have to address the diplomatic and peace making. And I think the real thing is to be, yes, security in Europe. Ukraine, as we know, in 1994, gave up its nuclear weapons and, was guaranteed its security, but actually it didn't work. And so we need a multifaceted peace approach. And of course, the UN and the UN Secretary General should be part of that. And, I'm aware, because I heard this from President Ramaphosa, that the President of the African Union, President Macky Sall, has gone to Russia, I think, at the moment, to plead about the food situation in Africa and the need to open the ports in Odessa and to actually bring about a peaceful solution, because Africa wants this war to end as quickly as possible, as we all do.
But do you want to see then international intervention to actually break that blockade?
I think, the best way to break the blockade is through diplomacy, through finding, the way in which it's possible to unblock and make sure it's safe from mines, etc., for food to move out of Ukraine and indeed, for that matter, out of Russia.
Let me ask you about the situation in Northern Ireland, which of course affects the whole of Ireland. As a former president of Ireland, we've got the Stormont Assembly meeting once again very shortly today. But every indication is that the DUP will once again block the functioning of the Assembly. They say they want to see changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which governs trade arrangements. How concerned are you about this political deadlock there in Northern Ireland?
Well, I have to be careful as a former president not to be drawn into what is a very hot political issue. But of course, I'm very concerned myself about the fact that this protocol was brought about by a decision of the government of the United Kingdom to go for a hard Brexit. And then the realization that there mustn't be a border on the island of Ireland because that would undermine the Good Friday Agreement. This was all agreed. That protocol would help business in Northern Ireland immensely if it was implemented by both sides in good spirit and faithfully. Business leaders in Northern Ireland recognize that. I was in Belfast not very long ago, particularly meeting with women leaders. There is dismay at the way in which the protocol is somehow being used in a way that doesn't actually help Northern Ireland. The result of the election was that more Assembly members who favour the protocol being worked well, rather than the other side who don't want the protocol. They're now in a minority. It may hurt them to be in a minority, but they are. And I think the United Kingdom should be, viewing this as an issue that they should handle very carefully, because the implications are, really very serious for my beloved island.
When you say the consequences could be very serious,
I don't want to go into any detail on that. I've said enough on this subject, because as a former president, I don't want to add to any difficulties.
Do you see a solution, though, Mary? Do you see a way forward of resolving what appears to be a very complex and intractable problem?
I don't think it's too intractable if there was a willingness to actually discuss the nuts and bolts of how to ensure that the single market is protected, which is a very big issue for the European Union, but also a very sensible approach to a flow of goods that are going to stay in Northern Ireland. That shouldn't be impossible if there was goodwill on both sides. And I think the constant reference to invoking Article 16 or trying to is not helpful. And in particular, the idea of introducing a law that breaks international law, because this is an international treaty, is certainly not helpful. I don't want to say any more about it because, as I say, I don't want to add to problems. I want to see a resolution of it.
I know that you are very keen to talk about climate change. Are you concerned that the whole issue, the pledges that were made back at COP26 6 months ago, are being pushed aside, given that there are so many more pressing issues? Of course, the war in Ukraine, as we've just been talking about, the global food crisis, energy crisis, the rising cost of living. Are you concerned that those pledges to tackle climate change are being forgotten, pushed aside, or just left to fester?
I am deeply concerned because the climate crisis is more important than any of the other issues because we're running out of time. At COP26, I was doing a lot of media work and I realized that the pledges made before and at COP26 themselves were not going to be adequate. We were still heading for a world that would be 2.4 degrees warmer by the end of the century, which is unlivable. And I pointed that out in some emotion. Since then, and as you said, partly because of the war in Ukraine, we're trying to find other fossil fuel to replace the Russian fossil fuel. I know that there are difficulties in European countries, but I believe firmly that Europe must move as fast as possible to renewable energy, 5 times or maybe 10 times faster than it's doing at the moment. And I know there's a private sector initiative that I support, and there's a women's push for that I support. That we're going to try and really encourage governments to recognize this is an opportunity for Europe to give leadership in going clean. And I watched the Egyptian Minister for Environment, Yasmin Fawad. I was on a panel with her for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation here in London on Friday, and she spoke about implementation when it comes to the COP in Egypt in November in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, the United Kingdom still has presidency of that COP until it hands over at Sharm el-Sheikh. And the United Kingdom, I'm sorry to say, is not fulfilling what it was promising in Glasgow. It apparently wants to open up oil fields. It apparently wants to look at coal. This is not, the kind of leadership that I would hope would continue as presidency of the COP.
Mary Robinson, former president for Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, now chair of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice and human rights. Thanks so much for talking to us, Mary.
Thank you.
You are listening to Times Radio. Carol Walker here, in for Matt Chorley this week, with Visa supporting small businesses on their digital journey.